conservation refugees are people, usually indigenous, who are displaced from the native lands when conservation areas are created, such as parks and other protected areas. Definition: conservation refugees are peoples, often indigenous, who are driven out of the traditional lands when those lands are set aside for a national park or wildlife sanctuary. Many of these people, like the Great Lakes DWE, were already marginalized before the imposition of the nature preserve on the territory. When they are driven out, they find themselves culturally dislocated and often living on the margins of urban areas and new settlements where they have very few social or economic opportunities. They rarely have legal recourse to rectify the situations, as they find themselves confronted with powerful state and international conservation interests. Many conservation refugees are placed in refugee camps. Role of NGOs. Environmental conservation is a highly debatable topic. NGOs receive funding from a variety of sources. Private foundations such as the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation once formed the bulk of the funds that support NGO conservation efforts. Funds from bilateral and multilateral sources and corporations also support NGOs. It is the increase in corporate sponsorship that is raising eyebrows among those who see a conflict of interest between the NGOs and the corporations that donate to them. Once beholden to the ethical rules and boundaries set by the private foundations that once constituted the majority of the funding, they have now become increasingly ethically negligent as a result of an increase in corporate funding. In spite of the proclamations of participation with local communities that can be found on websites of the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and Conservation International, actions do speak louder than words. The universally applied model of conservation based on Western science often clashes with indigenous knowledge of the environment. In most scenarios, the Western conservationist is arrogant and dismissive towards indigenous conservation models because they are not based on Western science, whereas indigenous knowledge is the result of generations of interactions with their environment. The idea of separating man from nature forms the core of the conservation movement. In his article entitled Conservation Refugees, Mark Dowie explains, John Muir, a forefather of the American conservation movement, argued that wilderness should be cleared of all inhabitants and set aside to satisfy the urbane human's need for recreation and spiritual renewal. It was a sentiment that became national policy with the passage of the 1964 Wilderness Act, which defined wilderness as a place where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. One should not be surprised to find hardy residues of these sentiments among traditional conservation groups. The preference for virgin wilderness has lingered on in a movement that has tended to value all nature but human nature, and refused to recognize the positive wildness in human beings. Dowie's words perfectly describe the problems that have emerged with the globalization of conservation, with the removal of indigenous communities from protected land. A symbiosis between the indigenous community and their environment is disrupted, resulting in a decrease in biodiversity. The refugees that were formerly living off the land are now prohibited from interacting with it. As a result of their expulsion, they are now extremely poor additions to the overpopulated areas surrounding the park. In many instances, poaching increases. Soil degradation occurs as new farmers take up agriculture for subsistence, and various other environmentally disastrous practices occur as a result of displacement. By ignoring the human factor, it is becoming ever clearer that the myopic approach of conservation that is taken by the large NGOs is ineffective and counterproductive. Preserving habitats are cultures. For the Adivasi from India, and the fact that in the spring of 2003 they were pushed out of the farmlands and relocated to extremely cramped villages in order to import 6 Asiatic lions. Through the efforts to conserve land, NGOs like the WWF infringe on basic human rights that every person is entitled to, which include inhumane treatment of local residents, the stripping away of land, and discrimination, just to name a few. Conservation refugees are often removed from the land for wildlife conservation, and often when they're forced to move, they are placed in communities or villages which leave them vulnerable to poverty and starvation. They are not compensated for what was lost and have no assistance. This becomes very overwhelming for them, and they have a hard time adjusting to this new lifestyle. In Green Ink, by Christine MacDonald, she quotes a tribal leader in saying that white men told them to leave the homes in the forest because the land was not protected. He also said that they were forced into another village outside the forest and that they had no choice, because they told them that they will be beaten and killed. Left without food and land, they were forced to work on farms that the villages before them had already established. This is the international non-profit group's idea of bringing the indigenous people the benefits of the modern world or to protect national economic interests such as tourism, eliminating culture and behaviors. The indigenous people that are forced out of the land also lose parts of their culture embedded in resources. Darrell Posey argued that indigenous knowledge could make a significant contribution to conservation. Posey also thought that what looked natural might be cultural, and thus that indigenous people should be seen as models for conservation, rather than as opposed to it, and thus denied land rights. Many of the local residents of these conservation sites and national parks have cultural rituals and practices that are adapted to the local environment. Through these practices, they have been able to survive, and a culture has emerged from this. Conservation Refugees by Mark Dowie reports on one such case, the Batwa pygmy from Africa. Having lived in conservation camps under restrictions that limit centuries-old cultural practices, community member Kwakwa Barumi observed that they themselves are dying out by saying, "We are heading toward extinction." Some of these restrictions include no cultivation, no hunting, no gathering, and sacred sites and burial grounds are off-limits, all of these being essential to their daily lives. These limitations help lead the way toward the extinction of hunter-gatherer groups around the world, to make way for new game reserves, and to help develop projects for ecotourism in which the national government gives land up easily for these projects and not for the local residents themselves. Redefining Conservation. When looking at Darrell Posey, who was a famous anthropologist and ethnobiologist and whose writings about the Kayapo Indians of the Amazon forest influenced environmental policy, in that traditional societies are now being viewed as helpers in conservation, and steps are being taken to help the reconstruction of these societies. Posey often stated that indigenous people were the only ones who truly knew the forests because they have inhabited them for centuries. What Posey also determined was that biodiversity was important for these indigenous peoples' lives through gardens, openings to the forest and rock outcropping, and that what is considered natural today may have been altered by the ancestors of these indigenous people and may not in fact just be naturally occurring all on its own as is thought. Posey's writings are helping to redefine conservation and what it means to these societies living on conservation sites. With the help of articles and books, the more people know of what is going on with conservation groups, the more they are aware counter and preventive measures start to take place to ensure that people are not treated unfairly. Some participants in the Help to Redefine Conservation are countries in South America which pay notice to indigenous areas that are willing to participate in practices of conservation with the technical resources from conservation groups, instead of being kicked out of the land. There is Federal Environmental Conservation Act that protect the rights to remain on the land and use its natural resources, and the Commonwealth Minister negotiates conservation agreements with them. Indigenous Peoples. The World Council of Indigenous Peoples, began by Chief George Manuel of the Shuswap Nation, held its first conference in British Columbia in 1975. After traveling the world, and finding that the same suffering and mistreatment felt by the North American Indians were also felt by many other indigenous peoples, he began the World Council of Indigenous People. Some indigenous peoples fought back politically by having a voice at important conservation meetings that affect them. According to author Mark Dowie, the Maasai sent their leader Martin Saringo to the World Conservation Congress meeting to defend the land rights at the November 22, 2004 meeting sponsored by IUNC in Bangkok, Thailand. Standing before the Congress, he expressed, "We are enemies of conservation. The nomadic people have lost most of the grazing lands over the last 30 years. At the meeting, Maasai reminds the IUCN and defends that they were the original conservationists. In another instance of indigenous people defending themselves politically, Dowie writes, Syed Sultani, the elected chair of the Council of Elders of the Kashakni Confederation in Iran, gave a speech to the World Parks Congress in Durban, South Africa in October 2003. Sultani discussed the relentless pressures on his nomadic pastoral people, how the pastures and natural resources were seized from them by various agencies, and the migratory path being interrupted. The summer and winter pastures were consistently degraded and fragmented by outsiders, and not even the social identity was left alone. Instances of violence and retaliation have also been a result of park creation. These cases have stemmed due to resentment from land regulations and restrictions, land displacement, or parks blocking needed access to resources, causing shortages. In Nepal, when the Sagame the national park was founded, the Sherpas harbored much resentment. They intentionally accelerated the depletion of the forest because the rights and traditional practices had been taken away. Local elders estimated that more forest was lost in the first 4 years after the park's creation than in the previous 2 decades. Several instances of violence have occurred separately in India due to fighting the unjustness of park creations. India is a heavily populated country with almost 500 protected areas. The protected areas, which are rich in resources, are mostly surrounded by agricultural lands and villages full of impoverished people who are in desperate need of these resources that are now blocked. People trying to obtain the basic life needs have caused violence to erupt. Inevitably, they invade the reserves and come into conflict with authorities. Resentment at the wildlife authorities' attempts to control the situation has exploded in violence against officials and guards. In the Nagin National Park in South India, wildlife guards were believed to have killed a poacher. This incident resulted in local people retaliating by burning 20 square kilometers of forest. In India, resentment by local people to national parks legislation and enforcement agencies has caused increasing problems. Many indigenous peoples from all over the world have been affected by large organizations trying to protect nature and wildlife, while overlooking the human component. Indigenous peoples have been left without rights to their own land, resources, and left impoverished. The displacement causes lasting effects on their entire community. They are fighting to not only keep the homes but also the cultures as well as their identities. Many groups fight to maintain their entire livelihoods politically and sometimes even with violence.